April 1963, the headquarters of the Vatican, the weekly newspaper L'Osservatore Romano, issued a globally shocking indictment. They did not condemn an armed conflict. They did not target a corrupt politician or a brutal dictator. Their target was a 31-year-old woman. The verdict was printed in bold and framed with an absolutely humiliating charge: vagabondagio erotico. Understood in everyday language, the Holy See defined her as an erotic vagrant. That woman was Elizabeth Taylor. The root of this historic sentence began with a captured moment. On a yacht anchored off the coast of the Italian island of Ischia, a paparazzo used a telephoto lens to record Taylor locking lips with her co-star Richard Burton. The photo was blurry, pixelated, and of terrible optical quality. But its value did not lie in photography. It lay in its destructive media power. At that time, Taylor was the center of a moral witch hunt. She had just gone through the pain of losing her husband Mike Todd in a tragic plane crash. Instead of leaving her alone, the tabloid press immediately dug into her subsequent relationship with Eddie Fisher. The spearhead of public opinion quickly labeled her a husband stealer, and now, on the set of the blockbuster Cleopatra, another adultery scandal broke out. Society immediately boiled over. Family value protection organizations in the U.S. called for a boycott. Millions of women spat on the name Elizabeth Taylor. But behind the crowd's moral outrage, another chessboard was being set up. 20th Century Fox, the studio responsible for producing Cleopatra, was on the operating table. Their financial report was a historical disaster. The project's initial budget was approved at $2 million. Through a series of management mistakes, constant set changes, and the director's bottomless extravagance, this number ballooned to $44 million. The capitalists at Fox were on the verge of bankruptcy. They were preparing to file for Chapter 11 protection. They needed a miracle, and that miracle appeared in the form of a love scandal. Instead of using the public relations department to set up a protective barrier for their lead actress, a basic privilege in every A-list contract, Fox's leadership decided to play a cold-blooded game. They issued press releases pretending to express deep concern about Taylor's morality. They played the roles of conscientious producers, deeply hurt by the depravity of their subordinate. In reality, they were weaponizing her private life. The system intentionally leaked schedules, feeding bait to the paparazzi. They understood a basic principle of behavioral economics. Hatred always goes hand in hand with irresistible curiosity. The more people cursed Elizabeth Taylor, the more they would want to spend money at the box office to see what that sinner looked like and how she dressed on the big screen. The Studio Alliance didn't need Taylor to be clean. They only needed her to generate enough controversy. They threw Taylor to the wolves to be torn apart. They used the global humiliation of a woman as their core marketing spearhead to recover a $44 million debt. While housewives in the American Midwest cursed Taylor at the dinner table, men in gray suits in Los Angeles were popping champagne, counting every ticket sold thanks to that very curse. A social death sentence was signed, simply to salvage a balance sheet. To understand why a system of power could so easily determine, manipulate, and completely drain Elizabeth Taylor's fate, we must look back at her medical and legal records from 1942. That was the year Elizabeth Taylor signed her first professional film contract with Universal Pictures. Shortly after, she was sold to the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer (MGM) empire, the most powerful film studio on the planet at the time. That year, Taylor turned 10. At the age of 10, a normal child is protected by the law with the right to education, natural physical development, and a childhood free from exploitation. But stepping through the guarded iron gates of MGM, Taylor was no longer an independent human being. Under the corporate management lens of mogul Louis B. Mayer, Elizabeth Taylor was coded on paper as an intangible fixed asset. Understood in the most ruthless economic language, she was a money-printing machine with a heartbeat, an investment product without civil rights, but expected to bring a massive return on investment for every centimeter of image. The process of molding MGM's precious jewel was not the cultivation of artistic talent. It was a systematic process of biological intervention and psychological manipulation. The studio's internal files recorded coercive medical directives. Taylor's baby teeth hadn't fallen out yet. They ordered them extracted. Dentists paid by the studio forced her into the chair, pulling out natural teeth to implant freezing porcelain crowns, aiming to create a perfectly mature smile right on the face of a little girl. Her body was placed under probation. Every ration of food put into her mouth was measured through a strict calorie control system. ensuring she never exceeded the weight prescribed by the board of directors. The deprivation did not stop at physiological structure. Taylor's teenage years were entirely confiscated. Teenage dates, the most basic fluttering emotions of growing up, were actually scripted PR, public relations campaigns. MGM's media experts would scan the list of young actors needing to polish their names. They set the time and date, arranged the restaurant, and hired paparazzi posing as passers-by. Taylor just had to wear the dress approved by the wardrobe department, arrive at the exact meeting point, smile, and play the role of a coy teenage girl in love. Any attempt at resistance, every exhausted tear was extinguished by legal weapons, the breach clauses of a standard 7-year contract. Any deviation meant her family would be cut off financially, facing ruinous compensation lawsuits. In 1944, the film National Velvet was released. The work achieved a box office revenue of $4 million. This was a massive number in the 40s, a financial record confirming the absolute success of the illusion production process. The American public eagerly lined up to buy tickets. They passionately gazed at a pure, obedient Elizabeth Taylor with glowing violet eyes. They entirely believed in the fairy tale prepared by the Hollywood industrial machine. Not one of those millions of spectators realized that the sparkling glass cage they were admiring was actually a chain of deprivation. The corporate machine had stolen the entire self-determination of a living creature, turning a girl's blood, sweat, and youth into lifeless profit report lines, transferred straight into the safes of the tycoons. Elizabeth Taylor's life did not belong to her. Legally, it was mortgaged by 7-year slave contracts. And when a living creature tried to struggle to escape the glass cage, the real tragedy began. At 18, Taylor sought to escape the studio's control through the most traditional exit, marriage. She chose Conrad Nicky Hilton Jr., the heir to the Hilton Hotel empire. But the top brass at MGM never let their assets walk away freely. Instead of stopping it, they decided to merge the marriage into a marketing campaign. Taylor's wedding in May 1950 was not a holy sacrament of love. It was an event staged to promote the upcoming film Father of the Bride. The studio paid all expenses. Her wedding dress was designed by Helen Rose, the very costume director of MGM. Every frame, every smile before the media was strictly directed. They turned the most sacred moment of a person's life into a commercial exploitation tool. Ruthlessly speaking, they sold tickets to see her wedding under the guise of a cinematic work. But when the honeymoon suite door closed, reality struck. Hilton was an alcoholic and an abuser. He savagely beat Taylor right on their honeymoon. He suffocated her newly blooming humanity. When Taylor became pregnant, a beating from Hilton caused her to miscarry. What was the power system's reaction to this crime? Calculated ignorance. MGM's security and public relations departments immediately blockaded the information. They arranged divorce settlements in silence. Their mission was not to protect an abused woman. Their mission was to protect the pure idol image, preventing any stain that could reduce box office revenue. Taylor was pushed back into the schedule grinder. The 14-hour daily filming schedule drained her physical strength. To keep this money-printing machine running, the studio's resident doctors began medical interventions. They prescribed amphetamine, a nerve stimulant, to force her to stay awake on set, and when night fell, they shoved barbiturates, high-dose sedatives, into her mouth to force her nervous system to shut down. A legal poisoning cycle was established. The psychological descent hit rock bottom in March 1958. Her third husband, producer Mike Todd, the only man at the time who treated her like a human being instead of a commodity, died in a horrific plane crash. The private jet named the Lucky Liz crashed straight into the mountains of New Mexico, incinerating everything. Taylor shattered. She fell into a state of clinical panic, and in the depths of loneliness and despair, she clung to Eddie Fisher, her late husband's best friend, the only person who understood her pain at that time. But the media didn't care about psychological trauma. The tabloid machine smelled blood. Fisher was then in a model marriage with actress Debbie Reynolds. Overnight, the press weaponized Taylor's widowhood. They ran headlines, labeling her a vixen and husband stealer. They ignored the fact that Fisher was a grown man with the right to make his own decisions. They channeled all of society's hypocritical moral outrage onto the head of a woman drowning in sedatives and mourning. The system had succeeded in twisting the victim into the perpetrator, and they prepared to harvest from that very outrage. 1960. The studio forced Taylor to star in Butterfield 8, a movie she despised, where her character was depicted as a high-class call girl. Taylor refused. The studio threatened to freeze her career, sue her in court, and sever her family's financial safety net. Taylor bit her lip and accepted. She worked in passive resistance, hating every frame of film. Spring 1961 in London. Taylor's exhausted body finally went on strike. She contracted a severe case of double pneumonia. On the night of March 4th, Taylor fell into a deep coma. Her skin turned cyanotic blue. She stopped breathing. In the emergency room of the London clinic, doctors had to perform an emergency tracheotomy. They cut a hole directly into her throat, inserting a breathing tube into her trachea to snatch her life back from the hands of death. Elizabeth Taylor had clinically died on the operating table. An obituary had already been prepared by newsrooms. The reaction of the studio alliance? Utter panic. But not for the life of a human being. The capitalists at 20th Century Fox, the ones preparing to shoot Cleopatra, were terrified by the prospect of their million-dollar project going down the drain. Taylor's survival at that moment was priced by the survival of the studio. When Taylor miraculously awoke with a crisscrossing scar on her throat, the Hollywood Academy suddenly awarded her the Oscar for Best Actress for her role in Butterfield 8. That was not an artistic recognition. It was a sympathy vote, a whitewashing of the industrial machine's crimes. They clapped to congratulate the one who had just returned from the dead, pretending that they themselves were not the cause that pushed her to that brink. Taylor clearly understood this hypocrisy. Holding the golden statue in her hands, she coldly stepped down. And then, the Cleopatra set in Rome began. The historic affair with Richard Burton broke out. The secretly taken photo on the yacht was splashed across front pages. The Vatican intervened. The whole world humiliated her. Fox pretended to condemn her, but secretly used the scandal to push advance ticket sales to a record level. But it was at the darkest moment, when betrayed and cornered by the whole system, that a spectacular transformation occurred in the mind of the 31-year-old woman. Elizabeth Taylor realized a fatal flaw in the machine. They hated her, but they couldn't make money without her. If her trauma was a commodity, then from now on, she would price it herself. Instead of bowing her head, crying, and holding a press conference to apologize like hundreds of other female stars, Taylor issued an unprecedented demand in Hollywood history. She refused to work unless she received a new contract. The number proposed was $1 million in cash, the highest salary ever paid to an actor in history. Not stopping there, she demanded an additional 10% gross participation, a ruthless clause for the producers. Put simply, for every dollar of ticket sales globally, Taylor would pocket 10 cents, regardless of whether the studio recouped its $44 million cost or faced bankruptcy. Fox bit their teeth and signed. They had no other choice. While society was busy cursing her as a vagrant, Elizabeth Taylor calmly became the most powerful and wealthiest woman in the entertainment industry. They weaponized her private life. She immediately commercialized their very hatred. From an exploited victim, Taylor single-handedly seized the hammer from the system's hands, preparing to bring down a deadly blow upon their heads. 1966. 3 years after the historic scandal in Rome, Elizabeth Taylor returned to the big screen in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. This time, no more sparkling violet eyes. No more surreal waistline and silk dresses. She intentionally gained 14 kilograms. She covered her face in old, wrinkled, and haggard makeup. She swore profusely, screaming on screen. She single-handedly smashed the intangible fixed asset that MGM's top brass had painstakingly molded since she was 10. The media alliance that once labeled her a vagrant was now forced into silence before a fierce performance. The Academy once again awarded her the Oscar for Best Actress. But this time, there were no sympathy votes. It was an absolute submission to an independent talent. But Taylor's true revenge did not lie in art. It lay in the marketplace. In 1991, Taylor launched White Diamonds. This was not a standard advertising contract where an actor receives a few $100,000 to hold a perfume bottle and smile for the camera. This was a brand licensing strategy. Pragmatically understood, Taylor retained absolute control, turning her own name, infamy, and the crowd's curiosity about her into an endlessly profitable stock. Those housewives who used to curse her for ruining other people's families, they were lining up at Macy's department store to buy White Diamonds. Those editors who used to write articles insulting her dignity, they now had to type headlines praising the record sales of this perfume line. Taylor forced society to open its wallets to pay for the very illusion they once despised. She turned hatred into a $1.5 billion empire. The cash flow now went straight into her account, instead of falling into the safes of men in suits in Los Angeles. She had completely reversed the supply chain of exploitation. However, true power is not just used to accumulate capital. Power must be used to break the system. The 1980s. The HIV/AIDS pandemic swept across the United States. President Ronald Reagan's administration chose absolute silence. The political elite ignored the lives of tens of thousands of marginalized people. The disease was so stigmatized that hospitals refused to admit patients. Funeral homes refused to shroud bodies. Fear engulfed the entire society. And right at the cruelest blind spot of that history, Elizabeth Taylor stepped out. She didn't just make empty appeals, she used the exact weapon the tabloid press had once used to attack her, the frantic obsession of the crowd. Taylor knew well that every paparazzi lens in the world was pointed at her. So, she calmly walked straight into the isolation wards. In front of dozens of flashing lights, she hugged, kissed, and held the hands of AIDS patients who were ulcerated and emaciated, people whom society at that time shrank away from in terror. The photo instantly hit front pages globally. The barrier of stigma was instantly snapped by the weight of an icon. In 1985, Taylor co-founded AMFAR, the American Foundation for AIDS Research. She flew to Washington, D.C. herself, testified before Congress, and used her personal influence to force senators to disperse medical research funds. She organized fundraising galas, forcing powerful capitalists in Hollywood to donate. If they wanted to be on Elizabeth Taylor's guest list, they had to write a check to save lives. Through tireless efforts, she raised over $270 million, directly funding research that discovered ARV antiviral drugs. The corporate machine that once intended to crush her into a moral cautionary tale now had to stand by and watch her become the savior of tens of thousands of lives. Pop culture history often remembers Elizabeth Taylor as a beauty queen, a symbol of 8 noisy marriages and massive diamonds. That is how the system wants you to remember her, to cover up the crime scene of a large-scale deprivation. But the truth is much sharper. She was not a submissive victim. She was a survivor. A woman thrown into the middle of a man-eating industry's siege, stripped of her childhood, physiologically exploited, and turned into media bait. But instead of letting them throw her into the trash bin of history when she was no longer useful, she gathered every shattered piece of humiliation, forged it into a blade, and pointed it back at the system. Elizabeth Taylor rose to become the master of the game, leaving behind a stinging indictment, forever mocking the entire machinery of power that once sought to dictate her fate.